Recently, there's been a huge hubbub, and I'm sure you're aware, regarding the purported crisis in physics. I had an interview with Sean Carroll, and he defended academia. His defense, though, wasn't just out of allegiance to academia. To me, it seemed a counterpoise to the growing societal mistrust in science, and he sees that as a detrimental trend. Today, I would like us to focus on not only the stagnation in fundamental physics, which is a specific claim, but perhaps the crisis in physics in general, maybe even science as a whole. And I'd like to hear what you have to say. I'll bring up objections as they occur to me, perhaps other people's objections as well. And I want to hear your objections to those objections. And we can even get into the issues of causes and solutions. Okay, well, why don't you distinguish the crisis in fundamental physics versus the crisis in physics, and then we can get to science afterward. And also, what is meant by crisis? Because I made a claim of stagnation to Sean Carroll, which is different than crises.
Right. So it's actually, when I give talks about this is always the first thing that I say. Like, I don't like talking about crisis. I talk about stagnation because it's clearer what it means. A lot of people actually think like if we had a real crisis, that would be a good thing because a crisis is an opportunity for a breakthrough or something, so we would know what to hit on. But that's not what it is. So to me, I think calling it a stagnation is much more accurate because that's what I see. We're just not going anywhere. We're just, like on a treadmill, pretending we're running, but not making progress. So I actually can't remember I've ever talked about, the crisis in physics overall, because I don't really know a lot about exactly what's going on in physics overall. It's just such a huge field with so many subdisciplines. So I tend to focus on what I call the foundations of physics, where we think about the most fundamental questions.
Right.
Because that's what I know about, right? And so the issue there is that we haven't really made any progress on answering the big open questions ever since they occurred, like a century ago. And then we made progress until the Standard Model was completed sometime in the 1970s, depending on how you count. And then you could say, for the next 5, 10, 15 years or something, people were just trying out different things, and they expected it to go somewhere. And at some point, sometime in the mid-1980s, maybe 1990s, it just went wrong, because what happened was that they started doing the same thing over and over again, and it just didn't work, and they never revised those methods. So we still don't know what dark matter is made of, if it's made of anything. We still haven't figured out how to quantize gravity. We still don't really understand how quantum mechanics works. So we haven't really found either a better theory or some phenomenon that we could actually hit on.
How are people supposed to resolve some of these foundational problems, such as quantum gravity, as you mentioned, or dark matter, without experiment to guide or to test between different theories? Because there are different proposed solutions to what dark matter is, as well as how to quantize gravity. It's just that they lie outside the experimental range. So would you say that's the theorist's fault, the experimentalist's fault, no one's fault?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So actually, strictly speaking, one shouldn't lump all these problems together, because each problem is its own problem. And dark matter is quite different from the other problems that I mentioned, because in this case, we actually do have some experimental data. So we know something isn't adding up, quite literally, actually. If we just take the matter that we know of, that we have in the Standard Model, and we put it out there, it just doesn't properly work. And so introducing some sort of dark stuff is a fix that you can do, but for one thing, it doesn't always work the way that it should be, so it brings up some other problems. And also it opens the question what is it made of? Is it made of anything? And then there's this competing theory, modified Newtonian dynamics or modified gravity in more general, and we still haven't really figure out how to rule one out or confirm the other, or yeah. So and then these other questions which we have, like quantum gravity is often portrayed as a problem of inconsistency. And we can talk about what exactly this means. Quantum mechanics, I've personally argued, it's also a problem of inconsistency, but I think if you ask other people in the field, they would object that this is the case. And then there are other problems that people like to talk about, which I actually think are not problems, which are some misgivings about the standard model, for example, like, the strong CP problem, or it's supposedly unnatural, like why is the Higgs mass so small, the hierarchy problem, as it's sometimes called. And there are a list of other issues that people have, like the baryon asymmetry and stuff like that, where I would say these are not good problems because it's not clear that they actually require a solution. So you can say, I don't like it that the standard model just has these 3 generations and we have no deeper explanation for it, but maybe that's just how nature is. Maybe nature just has 3 generations and there's no deeper explanation. So I think it's not a good problem to work on because we've nothing really to start with. Like there's no problem that's actually in need of solving, if you see what I mean. It's not the case with quantum gravity, where you can say, okay, actually, if we just take general relativity and we combine it with the quantum field theory, it doesn't work. We don't know what to do. So there's a real need to actually develop new mathematics. And I think that's what makes this a promising avenue.
Just for people who are unaware of some of the problems or so-called problems, one is about CP violation. And then there's something called theta, which looks to be 0 or close to 0. And then physicists don't like small values because they like to have some function that has a minimum of a small value. So they can say, okay, that's the reason for the small value. And you would say those are pseudo problems because maybe the reason is just how nature is. So let's talk about actual problems, which I believe you put into 2 categories. One of inconsistency with data. So perhaps the muon experiment would be that, or the data from it. And then the internal contradictions. So let's stick with internal contradictions. Quantum gravity is one, and the projection axiom of quantum mechanics is another. Is there another, or is it just those 2 for the internal contradictions?
Well, there are more technical issues related to quantum field theory, but it gets very mouthy very quickly. So maybe let's leave those aside. But yeah, there are some other mathematical issues that people have. Like, for example, I mean, you can ask, like, is quantum field theory actually a well-defined framework to begin with? Which is a very philosophical question to ask. If it works, do we have to worry whether it's well-defined?
Oh, interesting. That's super interesting. I didn't know that. I thought you're going in the other direction of any progress towards well-defining QFT.
This is what I said. I don't want to talk about. So yeah, because I don't really know. Really, this isn't something I have. Like axiomatic quantum field theory is not something that I've myself worked on. So I know it exists. I know there are problems that people work on, but I don't really know a lot about it. So
I see.
It's not a good topic to talk about because I'd just be talking random nonsense.
I see. So something I was going to say was, okay, would you consider soft theorems and asymptotic symmetries as progress in physics or progress in double copy relations like gauge gravity dualities or gauge gravity relations?
Well, this is all very interesting in the sense that it helps us to better understand the theories that we already have, but they don't really help us. It's no new physics in the sense that it's not a fundamentally new phenomenon that has been predicted. It doesn't really, at least I don't see how it helps us answering these questions, like the big questions that we just talked about. So, of course, people who work in the field, they see a lot of progress because they write a lot of papers. They try very hard to understand the mathematics. And I'm not saying that this is all useless. Especially I recently talked about this in a video, the amplitude-hedron
Yes.
stuff. So that's a very interesting development. And the entire ADS-CFT stuff is also pretty cool. They're learning lots about the mathematics of gauge theories, how quantum field theory actually works. Like there are many more structures than we thought there are. But when it comes to those big fundamental questions we started out talking about, at least right now, I don't really see what we learn from it about this. So there's a long story about Nima Karni-Hamed and the demise of space-time, or it's doomed, right? This is like space-time is doomed. Like this is the catchphrase.
Oh yeah.
That might be like, so maybe this is actually the way to do it. So maybe we have to describe quantum physics in terms of these amplitude-hedra, and that will give us a clue for how to deal with quantum gravity. But at least at the moment, I don't see it happening.
Yes, and you also see that as an argument of serendipity, that hopefully if we explore this, we're going to stumble upon a solution, but there are multiple different avenues we could have gone down. And if we constantly justify our explorations, we'll stumble upon something that'll be useful.
So the issue is serendipitous discoveries have happened and they'll probably continue to happen. But the question is like, how likely is it? So I don't have a big problem with people like, actually, I don't have a problem with most people, period. But research avenues like the amplitude-hedron or ADS-CFT and other very math-heavy stuff might teach us something. And yes, something surprising might come out of it. But I don't think it's just historically, it's not been a super productive strategy. And historically, people have also had the advantage of having some data to go by. So you already raised this question, like, so this is like the big issue. Like, we don't have any data to guide us to a theory of quantum gravity. And so that just leaves a lot of space for playing around with the mathematics, and you can overdo this. There's a lot of mathematics that you can guess, which is why we have all these different approaches to quantum gravity, right? And so everyone has their own idea about what's the right thing to do.
That's what this channel's about.
Yeah. So what do we do, Kurt? Right? So do we just make videos about everything, and then at the end of the day we have a vote about which is the nicest one? I think that's not a good way to do it.
Well, for me, the amplitude-hedron didn't impress me. It was interesting, but it was specifically for a certain type of quantum field theory, n equals 4 super Yang-Mills planar as well. But then it's been generalized recently to shapeology, I believe. I believe it's shapeology. And so now it can calculate without supersymmetry for phi cubed, I believe. But anyway, the point is that you would classify that as cool, but not progress.
Well, in some sense it's progress, but it's not progress on the questions that we talked about, right? So at least I don't see how it's the case. So we can have an endless discussion about what exactly do we mean by progress, right? Is it progress to write a paper? Yeah, well, so I think, personally, what I'm talking about is making progress on finding some sort of new physics. And this, to my mind, is better understanding the theories that we already have. And yes, you can call this progress in some sense, but it's not personally what I'm interested in. And honestly, I think it's not what most people are interested in when they talk about the foundations of physics. And then you come back and say, yeah, but actually, we have calculated some diagram to 3 more digits or something. They're like, oh yeah, cool, nice.
So there's a great diagram in one of your videos, and I'll overlay it on screen. I'm going to make it simpler than it is, where you show, here's the standard model on the x-axis. Let's just imagine standard models predictions are a straight line instead of a curve. And then deviations from that are what people predict, but we've only tested from 0 up until here. And so far the standard model is correct. And these predictions continue along the x-axis, but then people's theories all diverge from there. And then they say, look, I'm falsifiable because at other energy range, you can either prove me to be correct or incorrect. And then it's generally shown that the standard model is correct. So we do have a variety of different theories that make predictions, but they also lie outside the experimental range. So outside of dark matter, even though we don't know if dark matter is a particle, like no one's detected a dark matter particle. So we just have the distribution of dark matter. And my issue is it's so difficult to have progress in physics without experiment guiding us. Then the other question is, okay, well, look, if progress is difficult, why are we writing all these papers? And so I assume that that's part of your critique. And I wonder if embedded in that critique is, and taxpayers are paying for this. And then I wonder how much of your issue with the paper production, academia as a whole, would go away if it wasn't taxpayer funded.
Well, we still wouldn't make progress. So, just because you stop paying people doesn't help us understand how quantum gravity works. But yeah, so I think it's kind of a double combination. I'd say, well, if they're not actually making progress, then what are we paying them for? So it's like a double insult. It's not only that you think they should actually make a little more effort, let me put it that way, but actually we also have to pay for it. So, but yeah, so just stopping to pay them isn't going to help much. At least I don't think so. We have to think about some other way to do it. So I really think it's a systemic problem. And I also think that it's very field dependent exactly how these problems manifest. But at least in the foundations of physics, we're seeing this overproduction of predictive models that are being ruled out over and over again. And what I've tried to convey is that this is a methodological problem that physicists even think that this should work. And I really think it's some sort of misunderstanding of the philosophy of science. They think that just because you can write it down in mathematics and it's falsifiable, because in principle you can make a measurement and rule it out, it's good science. And I've tried to convey to them, that's not right. For it to actually be a scientifically useful hypothesis, it's got to solve some problem. The only thing you do is that you add something on top of the stuff we already have, but we don't actually need this for anything. And, just on a purely mathematical level, it's fairly obvious why this doesn't work, because there are like infinitely many of these possible predictions that you can make. So the probability for any one of them to be right is zero. So I'm not surprised that it doesn't work. And as you know, in my book, I've argued that if you look at the history of physics, the theoretical breakthroughs came from solving problems of inconsistency. And so this is just an observation, which I believe is to be correct. I don't actually know why this is the case, but it seems to work. And so this is why I've been saying we should focus on solving inconsistencies, like, for example, in quantum gravity, quantum mechanics, and forget about these pseudo problems like the hierarchy problem, strong CP problem, and so on.
Looking for the perfect holiday gift? Masterclass has been my go-to recommendation for something truly meaningful. Imagine giving your loved ones the opportunity to learn directly from world-renowned instructors. With Masterclass, your friends and family can learn from the best to become their best. It's not just another streaming platform, it's a treasure trove of inspiration and personal growth. Whether it's learning critical thinking from Noam Chomsky to gaining practical problem-solving skills with Bill Nye, or exploring the richness of history with Doris Goodwin, or my personal favorite, which is learning mathematical tricks or techniques from Terry Tao. There's something for everyone. Another one that I enjoyed was Chris Voss, a former FBI negotiator who teaches communication strategy. It's been a game changer to me ever since I read about Chris Voss from his book, and it was surprising to see him here on Masterclass, a pleasant surprise. Masterclass makes learning convenient and accessible, whether you're on your phone or your laptop or TV or just listening in audio mode. And the impact is real. 88% of members say Masterclass has made a positive difference in their life. For me, it's an incredible way that I discover, sometimes even rediscover, learning. Every class that I take helps me feel more confident, even inspired. And I've received great feedback from friends that I've recommended it to. There's no risk. It's backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee. Right now, they're offering an extremely wonderful holiday deal with some memberships discounted by up to 50%. Head to masterclass.com/theories and give the gift of unlimited learning. That's masterclass.com/theories, your gateway to unforgettable learning experiences.
Strong CP problem, and so on.
Well, I imagine your critique would also apply to the various theories of quantum gravity that exist, like loop or string, because string people would say, what we're doing is, well, we've solved one of the major difficulties in combining general relativity with QFT. Namely, you can't go all the way down to zero because you have a minimum string length, and you get gravitons popping out of the theory without putting gravitons in the theory. Isn't that progress? And I imagine you would say, either you would say maybe at first, or you would say no wholesale. So what do you say to that? What do you say to the numerous approaches to quantum gravity?
Yeah, well, consistency is all well and fine, but it's not the entire story. It can't be, because there are always multiple ways to resolve mathematical inconsistencies. This is why we have these different approaches to quantum gravity, string theory, and we can talk about which one. They all have problems. Let me put it this way, and there's a lot of argument about which one is better and which problems are more severe. But so we have string theory, loop quantum gravity, asymptotically safe gravity, and then there are some lesser known approaches like causal dynamical triangulation. So honestly, I don't know what happened to this. I haven't heard anything about this for some while. Maybe causal sets, which now seem to have somewhat of a revival in this hypergraph stuff, which I find very interesting. But so in the end, if you have a theory, you still need to go and test it. And I think the possibility, actually the need to test quantum gravity has been neglected for a long time because physicists just thought, well, it won't ever be testable anyway, which raises the interesting question, well, if that's what they thought, why were they working on it to begin with? Because then it's not really science. So in any case, so the interesting thing is that like in the past 10 years, this discussion has entirely shifted to, we might actually be able to test it. And I think the reason that this shift happened is that for a long time when people talked about testing quantum gravity, they had in mind what's called the strong gravity range, where you would actually see is it strings or is it loops? So you'd be able to tell apart, the details of whatever's going on at high energies. But actually, you should also see quantum gravitational effects in the weak field limit, which we can test in the laboratory. In principle, we're not quite there yet, but maybe we'll get there, like in a decade or two. And I can talk more about this, but I think that's a very interesting shift because people are now actually thinking about how to make predictions for experiments that might actually happen at some point.
Yeah, I spoke to Yvette Fuentes about her proposal for how to test quantum gravity in the lab. And then same with Chiara Marletto. There are different proposals that are being articulated. Now, you said solving internal inconsistencies is one thing, but again, there are a variety of them. So that seems to me, it's not a sufficient condition, it's a necessary condition to solve internal inconsistencies. What else would be a condition then? If you were the grant body, Sabine's the grant body, and people are coming to you with proposals for you to give some money to someone, in the theoretical physics end, what are you looking for?
Honestly, I would just tell them, don't ask me. Like, I think it's not a good procedure. We should go about this in some smart way. So the most obvious thing that I always tell people is learn from your mistakes. And this is exactly why I am so annoyed about what's going on in the foundations of physics, because that's not what they're doing. Like, they're just making the same mistakes over and over again. And so, and this is also the reason why we see so little novelty, because they're just, continuing to repeat the same stuff in, slightly different variations, but there's no big change. And then there's this entire societal problem where people who try something different have trouble getting funded. So I guess this would be one of the major points. I think there needs to be, if you want people to start something really new, they need more time than you have on most of the current grants that you get, which are typically they're 2 or 3 years, which in practice, it means that you have to think about applying for the next grant the moment you start working on the current one. It just makes people very, very risk averse. Because you have this pressure in your back that you need to bring in money again soon. So you need to produce results, like reliably, several papers a year or something like that. Otherwise, it doesn't look good. So you can't just say, I'm going to think about this big question for the next 5 years and see what comes out of it. It's not possible. And of course, you don't want to hire 10,000 people who just sit around and think big thoughts. That doesn't make sense either. But I think you need a few people at least being able to do this. And it looks to me like we just have too few people who can do it. And it's becoming fewer and fewer instead of more and more. And the other issue, which I've talked about in my first book quite extensively, is the issue of self-reinforcing bubbles that you get in research, of which I think string theory is a very good example. String theory and also supersymmetry. All these beyond the standard model predictions that I made for the LHC, which didn't work out. Because what happens is that once you've made your PhD in a particular region, you get a postdoc in it, you apply for grants on it. At some point, it becomes basically impossible to change topic, because no one will give you money, no one will hire you, because it would take a year or maybe 2 years to learn something new. So I think a very simple thing we could do to prevent this self-reinforcement, because people can't get out of the field, so they're constantly forced to tell themselves that this is what they want to do, and to attract more funding to the same thing, is to just give people a chance to start something new without pressure to having to produce papers immediately. So some kind of, refocusing grant, or maybe that's not a good word, redirection grant. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So it sounds like two solutions is, okay, well, one problem that people think is that there's the reliance on grants, but you're saying it's not just a reliance on grants, it's a reliance on these short-term grants, short-term being 2 to 5 years, because in order to make large progress, you need much longer timescales. So an over-reliance on short-term grants, and that the grants don't pay you to switch topics, and switching topics may be necessary. So we have sour grapes, which is that if you're trying to achieve something and then you fail, you look at that and then you start to scorn that. But we have the opposite, which is if you have something, you start to adore it. In string theory, you start to adore it and start to think that it's what's required to bring you forward or the field forward. Correct my incorrectness here.
I'm pretty sure that's part. Well, so I don't know. So I haven't psychoanalyzed the entire string theorist community. I've interacted with some of them, and I think that most of them, they actually believe in what they work on. So I think it's genuine. And I think it's mostly because the people who are not actually convinced that this is a good thing to do, they just leave, because it's not that the working conditions are so great. You have to have enough motivation to take some pain, basically, to stay in academia. And so I think most of these people, they're generally motivated, but much of it comes from this social reinforcement. Like they live in a community where people constantly tell each other that this is the right thing to do. And especially in the string theory community, this was, at least 20 years ago, when I had more to do with them, was quite extreme. Like they rarely ever talk to someone who was not a string theorist. And so it's actually, again, this is just my impression, it's actually become much better since there's more of the ADS-CFT stuff, because that ties into other research areas like condensed matter physics, heavy ion physics, and that sort of stuff. So it's less isolated now.
Yeah, that was a point that I brought up to Sean Carroll. Because Sean was saying, well, I was suggesting to Sean that he was misrepresenting the views that are saying that there's a crisis in physics, because the people who are saying that are actually making an extremely specific claim about theoretical physics and fundamental laws, not just physics as a whole. And he started spouting off engineering feats, like look at topological phases of matter or condensed matter physics and so on and so on. And I was saying, okay, well, but that's not what your opponents mean. And then I was saying that if there is a crisis and not just a stagnation, it's a combination of a stagnation and a silence, with the silence being that in the string community, say, they don't listen to theories that are outside of it. In fact, they don't know, and then they'll say that the only game in town. And then when I speak to string theorists and I bring up alternative theories, they'll say, well, they couldn't recapitulate them in a manner that the theorist would agree with.
So when I, like 20 years ago, when I actually worked on quantum gravity, mostly on the phenomenology of quantum gravity. So I've always been interested in how can you test this stuff. And you can try to squeeze some predictions out of string theory phenomenology, or you can take loop quantum gravity, or you can take other approaches. So this is why I've interacted with people who've worked on all kinds of different stuff. And it's certainly true that usually they didn't know what the other people were even talking about. Like they had a lot of prejudices. And sometimes, it was a little bit silly. So I don't really know what's happened in the past 15 years, because I just stopped working on this. But as I said, it's like my impression is just vaguely, it's like the entire loop quantum gravity stuff has totally spun off into its own direction. Like, so no one has any idea what these people are doing. They just, they just do their stuff. And then you have the string theorists, which and then the entire community is split up into two camps, basically. So there's one, this is now the much smaller camp, are those which think that string theory is like a theory of everything, and it will give us the correct theory of quantum gravity and all that kind of stuff. And then you have those people who think of string theory as a useful tool to better understand quantum field theory, and this is where most of the ADS-CFT stuff now lives. It's a tool to better understand strange metals. Like this is a typical, selling point that people like to raise. It's possible. I think that the possibilities have been hugely overhyped, but I would probably say this about pretty much everything. So it's not specific to string theory. But yeah, I mean, so this is not specific, I think, to this particular research direction. You see this in a lot of other areas too, that they're kind of forced to over-specialize, and they fall apart into different camps. And they have to have some reason for why their stuff is better than that of the other people. And often they do this by just ignoring what the other people do. You also see this in astrophysics, in this debate between dark matter and modified gravity. It's actually quite shocking how many of the people who are totally opposed to modified gravity have no idea how it actually works. Like, so I've seen this with my own eyes. They're just like, no, we know that dark matter is the thing. And then they point to something totally silly like the bullet cluster. which, the bullet cluster is like this one observation, which is neither here nor there. Like, so it's generally hard to explain with everything, seems to be a statistical outlier, whatever. But they have like this catchy image, this with the blue and red. You should show this image while I fumble around here. So it doesn't make any sense. And they say, this proves it. But if you look at the details, it's just not true. And so I always find this a little bit distressing that actual astrophysicists who should know this stuff, like who should actually look at the details, would look at this. Like, is it actually true? Does it actually rule out modified gravity? Because it doesn't. You could as easily spin a story that says it rules out dark matter. And there are other stories like, with the cosmic microwave background. And this is all stuff that Stacey McHawk has been going on like forever. How actually the peak of the CMB actually ruled out dark matter. If you look at the predictions, I looked at this at some point, it's actually true. They made a prediction which actually disagreed with what was observed, but they did not conclude that dark matter has been ruled out. Instead, they fumbled around with the theory. The distressing thing about this is that if you talk to astrophysicists, they'll not know this stuff. Like, so it's not in the code of their group, basically. So it just becomes forgotten. And this is what I find terribly distressing. It's one thing to draw different conclusions from the data, that's fine. But just not even know what's going on elsewhere, that's not good. That's a serious community problem.
So then do you see another grant being, hey, know your competitors? Or do you think that's part of your job as a physicist?
Yeah. So I think that physicists, not just physicists, like this is an overall science thing, they need to be more conscious about these social dynamics that force them into some corner where some things can just become totally forgotten, or they're so convinced that something is actually correct, they never themselves go and check it. So I find this hugely worrisome. And this is also the reason, by the way, why we had all these wrong predictions for what would happen at the LHC. All the stuff about supersymmetry and dark matter particles were supposed to show up in extra dimensions and gravitons and black holes and whatnot. Well, they were all, you already alluded to this with the theta parameter. They were all predictions based on this idea of naturalness, which is not a scientific criterion. It's ultimately, if you look at it, right, it's an argument from beauty. And I've tried to talk to people in this community, like before the LHC even turned on, and I was trying to figure out, like, why are you using this? Why do you believe in this? And they insisted it's a mathematical criterion. And you can still see this, like on the archive today. People still use these arguments. And I think this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. So they've grown up learning that this is how you construct a theory, that this is a good criterion, and they never question this. Where I would say, well, you should not just trust these other people, what they say. And so yes, so in the beginning you asked this question about trust in science, and this is like one of the key reasons why I have difficulties trusting scientists, because I've seen this going wrong in my own community.
This is a great point to talk about the general mistrust in science, but also your issues with science in general. So let's get to the so-called crisis in science. I believe, let me double check if you have a YouTube title. Well, you could tell me if you have a YouTube video called The Crisis in Science. And it wasn't referencing someone else, like you're actually stating there's a crisis in science.
Yeah, I've certainly stated this, but I can't really remember what the title is. Sorry, because I change the titles frequently, so I have no idea what the current title is. You have to look it up.
Okay, so let's give some behind the scenes to people who aren't YouTubers and don't know about testing thumbnails and testing titles, and then they just see something like The Crisis in Physics. Let's just imagine you came up with a thumbnail like that, or your team did, and then they say, Sabine, what you're doing is clickbait, and you're the one contributing to the distrust in science with such inflammatory remarks. So what do you say to that? Give people some behind the scenes.
Look, people used to make fun of how bad my thumbnails are. So if they now say your thumbnails are clickbait, I'm like, yeah, finally figured out how to do them. Yeah, but somewhat more seriously, I think most of the people who complain about titles and clickbait and, YouTubers are just doing this for the clicks and whatever, they don't know the first thing about how YouTube works. So if it was that easy to do a clickbait video and get rich with it, everyone would be doing it. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, as you already alluded to, so typically we write down a whole set of titles. We produce a whole set of thumbnails, which luckily now you can automatically test at least 3 of them. If you have more, you have to iterate it a few times. And the thumbnail and title you see at the end is the one that works best. And so that's how it works. And yeah, I mean, so of course, everyone, I think, on YouTube tries to find a way to communicate the message of the video to their audience in the best way. And typically, I just try to find something, sometimes that's a really dumb way to summarize what's in the video. So in this video, I explain X, Y, Z, because I found that the titles that really don't work are those which misrepresent the content of the video. Often that's, not deliberate. But, I look at it later and I'm like, I think it's about something else than what it actually is about. And it's surprisingly difficult. I mean, there's a reason why big newspapers have headline writers, because that's not simple. So, I know this now sounds like I'm apologizing for something. I'm just trying to say, it's not as easy as people make it sound. I usually just try to be really to the point. And I guess that's kind of my trademark. I just say things as they are, and some people find it offensive. I suppose that's just how I am.
Have you always been that way?
Yeah, pretty much. A lot of people blame it on me being German. Maybe that's part.
I think you blame it on yourself being German.
Yeah, I mean, to some part. I mean, I've heard this. I've heard this a lot. Like, this is a stereotype. Like, Germans are. This is what I've been told. Okay, so Germans are very direct, and they often come across as impolite or unfriendly. And if that's what people think, then I guess that's true. I'm not deliberately trying to be impolite or unfriendly, and I think most Germans wouldn't see me that way. But yeah, I mean, so I guess I've always been more the kind of person who said, I think that's bullshit. And then I just say that it's bullshit. Yeah, and I guess some people find this appealing somehow, yeah.
I think that's an inveterate personality trait. I think that's trait agreeableness in the Big Five model of personality, which has a heavy genetic component. So maybe there's some truth about Germans, though I need to see a population study.
I definitely got it from my mother.
Okay, now what about humor?
Yeah, what about it?
Your videos have plenty of jokes. Are those your writing? Is it your team's writing? Is that something that runs in the family? Is it something that comes naturally to you?
No, I actually do them myself. I've tried to outsource them to other people, but it doesn't work very well. I tend to find not other people's jokes funny. There's also the issue that I try really hard to make my jokes kind of intelligent, if that makes sense. So they're actually often about the science. Some of them are insider jokes that I think most people won't really understand. So it's really hard to leave this to someone else. So I've been doing it myself. Some days I feel more funny than on other days. Sometimes it's really difficult to come up with some joke, which is also one of the reasons why I used to make these phone jokes. That the phone would ring and it would be the president, and I would be like, oh, yes, we will adjust the phone structure constantly, immediately, or something. And the thing is, like, it took me a really, really long time to come up with these jokes. I now have, a much more respect for stand-up comedians and people who are professionally funny, because it's just so difficult. At some point, also, you don't want to repeat yourself too much. So this is basically why I, every once in a while I do it, but not as regularly as I used to.
I used to do stand-up when I was 18.
Oh, really?
And what you do is you get an open mic. You're 5 minutes in an open mic. And I told myself, every time I go to an open mic, I'm going to come up with a new 5 minutes. And it was so much work. And I bombed. So I did extremely well the first few times. And then I bombed on my 5th or my 4th or 6th time. And then I remember that crushed me because I did so well the first few times. And I just had this pride and this overconfidence. And then I stopped doing it for a year afterward because I was so traumatized from that.
So what, did you start doing it again?
Well, afterward. And then I continued doing it for a while afterward, and then it petered off because I became a filmmaker and I used my math skills for that, and then became a podcaster using the math and the physics from my undergrad.
Okay, that's pretty cool. I would actually I'd be very interested in hearing some of the stuff. Think about it. I'm serious.
It's embarrassing.
It can't be more embarrassing than my stupid jokes. But yeah, so if you talk about science, if I do a video about, I don't know, the amplituhedron or something, there's this additional problem that people need to understand it's a joke. Like, so if you go to a comedy show, you're supposed to laugh.
Yes,
right?
yes, that's
so
right.
I always have to make sure that people actually know it's a joke, and now you're supposed to laugh.
Well, part of that could also be the editing. So when you're about to launch into a joke, the camera zooms in, or your team cuts in.
We do this, right. And, I have kind of this joke voice, with kind of signals to people, now that's a joke. You can laugh now. But it doesn't always work. Some jokes just fall flat. People don't really see what's funny about it or something. So, yeah, it's much more difficult than most people think, I guess.
Do your kids find you funny?
I don't know. Do you have children?
No.
So the weird thing, that's a start.
That's supposedly the precursor.
So the thing about children is that up to a certain age, they don't understand jokes. And I found this to be, it's kind of bizarre because I constantly make little jokes, little ironic, statements about, something like, oh, really? I would never have thought about this. If I drop something, right, and you have this 5-year-old who says, "Mommy, you just dropped an egg," and I'm like, "Oh, really? You don't say?" This sort of thing.
Yes.
Children don't understand that it's a
sarcasm.
Joke. And so they'll take it seriously, and then they will point out, yes, there's an egg, and you're like, yes. And so at a certain point, they start understanding this, like around the age of 9 or 10 or something. And mine are now in the age where they start making their own jokes. So I find this very interesting.
Okay.
So it's like, they're kind of trivial jokes at this point. The sarcasm is particularly simple, I think. I actually try to not use it all that much because it's kind of too simple. People.
You mean to say in your videos?
Yeah, it comes across. So I've tried ChatGPT to get to write jokes, but most of what ChatGPT generates are sarcastic remarks, and they always sound more or less the same. So it becomes really boring. But yeah, I guess that's like the simplest thing to do. And, I've like 3-4 books, titled How to Be Funny or The Most Common Types of Humor and stuff like this.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, that's hilarious, isn't it?
That's so funny. Yes, as you're studying it, it's like it's math.
Hey, come on, I'm a scientist, right?
Yeah, so Sabina, I should be saying Sabina, correct?
Yeah, but don't worry about it.
All right, Sabina. One of the reasons I got into comedy, I never said a single funny thing until I was 18. And the reason was I loved Seinfeld. I loved any comedy, but I never thought I could just produce comedy. And then I thought, okay, it turns out Seinfeld himself, Jerry Seinfeld, didn't say anything funny, at least not to his family, until he was 22. He just decided to be a comedian once he graduated. And I remember thinking, why can't I study how comedy works in the same way that I study a math problem? So I was taking real analysis when I was 17. And I remember some of those problems were extremely difficult and thinking, okay, why can't I just treat jokes like that? So I started writing out jokes and I started finding the formulas. And like I mentioned, when I went on stage, I did extremely well the first few times. The guy thought that I've been doing it for months. So this analytic quality of analyzing jokes does work.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed the same. I think it works up to a point because I look at the really good comedians. It's a lot to do with the way of presenting things. It's a lot about the acting. You know, they're just funny in themselves. And I'm a bad actor. So like, I just can't do it. You know,
Yes,
I think it's like,
I understand.
you know, expressively, I'm not funny. So this is why the sort of jokes that I make, they're kind of not funny in a sense. You know, they're funny because they're not funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I try to do what I can. So how do we end up talking about about jokes? Yeah, you were what?
I was so rationalistic when I was 18 that I remember saying, if I'm going to come up with a joke, it has to be such that a robot could read this joke in the same intonation and it would get a laugh, that it's not going to get a laugh because I'm doing something physical with my body or I have the correct confidence. And I didn't like Kramer from Seinfeld because of that. Because I remember thinking that's slapstick and I wanted to be like Seinfeld. I looked up to Seinfeld and he said he analyzes jokes with a scalpel.
Mm-hmm.
He picks them apart and down to the syllable. And I like that. I like playing with the words. But anyhow, when you and I met, we, at the Institute for Arts and Ideas, you talked about how you tried to get people to write your scripts before. You tried to outsource some of it and with people who are researchers, not just script writers. But it didn't work. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so so it was not a 100% failure. I've worked together with some very good people who saved me a lot of time by doing the research, you know, going through the literature, finding out what are the key references, reading them, what are the key points in the references. But I've found it very hard to find, basically impossible, to find someone who's both good at doing the research and actually writing a script for YouTube.
Right.
And so in the end, I always ended up doing most stuff myself. I also had a few script writers who unfortunately brought in some mistakes. That I only caught in many cases coincidentally because it happened to be something that I knew, and then I became suspicious and I started looking up all this other stuff, and so I've cycled through a lot of people very quickly. So one thing, for example, which has driven me nuts is that I've always told people, like, so I'm a little bit over-organized. So if you start working with me, you get a long sheet which says what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do, because I don't like to repeat myself. And there's this, like, one of the key things is always don't trust secondhand references, like never, ever. You know, a website that says, you know, there's been a report and the report says XYZ. You have to look at the report, and you wouldn't believe how often you look at the original source and it actually didn't say this thing.
Right.
And I still, you know, some people, you know, it doesn't matter how often you tell them, don't do this. They'll still do it and they think they'll get away with it. And unfortunately, in the end, I'm the one who's responsible for it. Like, so, and I always think that I should check everything, but of course I don't. And I don't always notice. And this is why shit happens. And in the end, I'm the one who gets blamed, right? So now I mostly, I pretty much do everything myself at the moment, which is also not a good arrangement. This is why I mostly talk about stuff that I know about myself, at least a little bit.
So here's something else. We tell our kids that we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover. We even claim to be living by that philosophy ourselves. You're just supposed to review the content itself, not the packaging of the content. It's on the inside that counts. However, people will at the same time claim that they dislike the YouTube titles. So why? If the content is there, then why do you care? Is it that we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but please do judge it by its thumbnail?
Yeah.
Or are we not supposed to withhold judgment until we understand the substance or content? Like, which is it? And another one that I see is you're supposed to judge people by their own merits. But now it seems like people are judging others based on who does their audience comprise. So in other words, it's like you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but you can by its sales demographics.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I don't really see this a lot in my comments, and also like generally, like on YouTube at least, you know, there are weird things going on X Twitter, as you've probably noticed. Like, it's a very strange place, and it's becoming stranger every day. But at least for what I see in my YouTube comments, to the extent that I can read them, like, I mean, I get thousands of comments a day, so I can't really read them all. I try to read as many as I can. They're mostly from normal people, I would say. You know, they're interested in physics. You know, the interested layperson is how I would describe most of the audience of my channel. Many of them are also students of one field or another, typically physics and associated disciplines. And of course, many of them, and I know that you get this too, are independent researchers. They work on their own stuff.
Right.
And they have their own ideas about everything. And it's fine with me. So I don't really see a big problem with this. And then you get what you call the science deniers, who are looking for a reason to dismiss some scientific finding that they don't like. Very often that's climate science. Because it doesn't fit with their political views or something like that. And they'll jump on everything which proves their point that you can't trust scientists. The thing is that I understand where these people are coming from. As I said, it's like, so what I've seen going on in my own field basically destroyed my trust in scientists, and I haven't yet gotten it back because I haven't done anything to fix the problem. I've no reason to think that the same problem does not also exist in other disciplines, which is why I've looked very closely at what they do in climate science. And I've actually been to some conference and I talked to climate scientists. I've interacted with a bunch of them, which is why I can now confidently say, no, climate change is not a hoax. It's a real thing. And climate science, the community has its problems, but the problem is not that they're making up climate change. And so my approach to this science denier problem is to take them seriously, because there was an origin for their mistrust, and to try and address this, like, you know, on a substantial basis, to look at the science and say, no, this is why the evidence is sound. And so people still have this mistrust of the institution of science. And I think the only way that we can address this problem is to actually make it better.
So in other words, you're counter to the people who are saying, like, look, Sabine, with your scintillating rhetoric, people love the word rhetoric, your scintillating thumbnails or what have you, that you're contributing to the distrust or mistrust of science. You're like, no. Firstly, there are some people who will always abstract away and decontextualize something and use that as ammunition for whatever their cause is. So that will always be the case. So firstly, there's that. But secondly, you're bringing up issues that aren't talked about, and now scientists are talking about them. People in academia are talking about them. Many people in academia agree with you, by the way. And so you're contributing to the public trust of science, or at least you're trying to bring that trust back by strengthening science. Is that a fair recap?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to try and sweep these problems under the rug, because at least I think they're totally obvious. Like, so here's an interesting thing that a lot of people in academia like to forget. I think it's something like 90% of people who do a PhD or, you know, who do something in academia leave. So there are a lot of people out there who have first-hand experience with academia, who no longer work in academia. And those people know perfectly well what's going on. And I actually know from the feedback that I get that a lot of the people who are very concerned about what's going on in academia, they know what they're talking about. They've seen it with their own eyes. So it's not as easy as saying they're all climate deniers, they're all somewhat weird in the head or something. So I think this is a serious problem. Right. We need to do something about it. And the first thing you need to do is to acknowledge that you have a problem, basically.
So I was surprised when you said earlier that there aren't enough people that are thinking about the foundational issues, because to me, there's an overproduction of these people. And in my estimation, from what I see from being on the inside, formally on the inside of academia, and also from speaking to people who are on the inside and just seeing this whole trend, it seems like we're producing many, many physicists or people with physics skill sets and people with mathematics skill sets, and then they don't have a place to go. So I'll read a recent tweet. Someone said, "Me, after finishing my PhD, surely I'll be able to find some jobs in my field." No. Next. Okay, how about getting access to the online journals so I can continue my research? No. Okay, at least I can still upload my work onto free online preprint repositories, right? Also no. And then you even commented, this really shouldn't happen. I feel we need to create a scientific underground. So do you also see that there's an overproduction of scientists, or you don't see that? And I want to know more about this scientific underground as well.
So the overproduction of PhDs, like this is a long-standing problem that has been discussed forward and backward. And I think most people who I've talked to about this agree that this is driven by the need for cheap researchers. So a lot of this bringing in grants depends on how quickly you can churn out papers. And the more students and the more young postdocs you have that you can put in cheap positions, the better. And so you see this in a lot of institutions, and I've seen this with my own eyes. Actually, I was one of them, is that you hire students, young postdocs, you put them on these super cheap jobs, they produce their 3 papers, you kick them out. But for most of them, there are no positions to land on. There are just not sufficiently many jobs. And the reason this doesn't change is that the people higher up in the hierarchy, like the professors, especially the younger ones, they need these people to produce all these papers. And I think this is why this isn't changing. I don't really know what to do about it. I'm just telling you, I think that's what's going on. I remember this tweet, and the reason I thought it was interesting is that this is a problem I've seen with a lot of people who I know who've left academia, mostly voluntarily, and they went on to take some other job, something that would feed the family more reliably, basically. But they don't lose their interest from one day to the next. In many cases, they have unfinished research, or maybe they have some other research things that I want to work on. And, they do it on the weekend, out of passion. But then they have the problem that since they're no longer affiliated with some institution, some journals won't even accept their submissions, which I think is just totally crazy. Like, why do you need a university affiliation or something to submit a paper to a journal that's supposed to be peer-reviewed? That doesn't make any sense. And you can also ask, like, if they want to go to a conference, they can't apply for any funding or something because they don't have this affiliation. And then there is also the community problem, right? You're no longer really tied into the community, and you fall a little bit out of touch. And as I said earlier, like just looking at the numbers, I don't have really, I have the exact numbers on top of my head, but I'm pretty sure like the majority of people who have something to do with academia at some point leave eventually. So, and this is why I had this tweet about the scientific underground, which is loosely speaking how I've become to call it. It's all those people who want to do this research work, but who are not affiliated with a university or some other research institute, but what do they do? How do they organize themselves? Why can these people not apply for travel grants? Why can they not submit papers? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so this seems to me, if I had more time, maybe I would do something about it. It can't be so difficult to fund some sort of community where people can get together and try to find a way to solve this problem. But yeah, I think it's a growing problem. I see more and more people in that position who are frustrated about it because they've written a paper. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about some people with their revolutionary new quantum mechanics. It's typically, it is like super technical stuff, some sort of data analysis or, something that came out of their PhD.
It's not a printout from ChatGPT.
Yeah, right. Or actually, this tweet from the guy, what he wanted to do was he wanted to post his PhD thesis on the archive. And, he's already got his PhD, right? So how bad can it be? Why can't they just let him post his PhD thesis? This is crazy. And of course, I understand the archive is they have a lot of problems with whether they find people to moderate the papers. And so there are things going wrong there. But I have even less understanding for this when it comes to journalists who are actually making money with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm extremely interested in independent scholarship. So while the Theories of Everything audience has a large amount of academic researchers who watch the show, I want to contribute to academia in a way that's outside the academy. And I see this as a large gap in a way that supplements the academy rather than opposes it or overthrows it or what have you. I see the universities as doing something necessary, and I'd like to help that and see where its problems are and fill in the gaps. But I'm not entirely sure how to do that. So anytime, Sabina, when you have ideas or anyone from the audience, and just feel free to contact me. I want to bring up something you said I want to bring up a critique that I've heard thrown at you that I think is unfair. And then I want to bring up something that I think you said that was unfair in one of your videos.
Okay.
So a critique that is thrown at you, which is something you just said, which is, look, you outlined a problem, then you said, I don't know how to solve it. And some people are like, look, she's just bringing up problems. What are the solutions? I think that's quite unfair. In the scientific method, your propositions just live and die on their own as to whether they're true or false. You can state a problem without knowing a solution. So in the early 2000s, when Lee Smolin came out with his book against string theory, the string theorists criticized him. They were saying, look, Lee, you're just trying to promote your own theory, namely loop quantum gravity. Peter White, at the same time, had his own criticisms of string theory. And then the string theorists came to him and said, look, well, you're just criticizing without putting up any alternative. Put up or shut up is something that people say. I don't think that's fair. I think a criticism should stand on its own. It's not whether there's a solution attached to it. Then something that you said that I think was unfair was Peter White now does have his own alternative. And I remember you in a video, and I don't recall the video, so I apologize, but you were lamenting some science problem, and then you were saying the only people who are talking about this are me, Peter White, and Eric, and those two have their own solutions that they're trying to peddle. And I was like, okay, but that doesn't minimize what they're saying. Now, that was an offhanded remark in just a single video, and you have thousands of videos, and so it's unfair of me to even bring this up, because if you examine anyone who has such a wealth of content, you'll find different sentences here and there to nitpick. So I don't want this to be that I'm ill-natured or perverse in my carping, but I just like you to expand on that, to tell me what your thoughts are on what I just said.
I can totally tell you what. So first of all, it was mostly meant as a joke. So I know both Eric and Peter White, and what I had in mind when I said this was that we had a meeting, and this is a really long story, which was Eric Weinstein's idea, and we all sat together with some other people, including Garrett Lacey, and it was about theories of everything. Like, officially, kind of, the topic was my book. My book, Lost in Math, in which I explained how you should not go about theory development. Right. So my entire point is like you have to have a concrete problem to solve. Like you have to try to find an inconsistency to resolve, and then you have to try to find a way to experimentally test it. So this is like my summary. And of course, you can disagree with that, and maybe have a better way to do it. But so the irony of the whole thing was that I ended up with these people who do exactly what I said we should not do, right? Like so Gerrit Lisi, Eric Weinstein, Peter White. This is exactly the same thing that they also do. and so I find this, it has a certain irony to it. I understand that.
When was this meeting?
Jesus, it must have been before Corona. Sorry, this is how the Germans call it, COVID. I don't know why the Germans stuck with this, calling it Corona, but yeah. So I think it's funny because I've tried to get people to understand my criticism, and even the ones who are sympathetic to it don't want to actually use it. And so I'm like, okay, all right, whatever. So what can I say?
About when you said that you have investigated climate change, and then you've talked to climate scientists, and you've seen how different, it's called Gell-Mann amnesia, I believe, where you see, actually, no, it's not Gell-Mann amnesia in this case. It's the opposite, where you've noticed how false scientific reporting can be in physics, but then you've actually investigated it in other domains. And so now you're just not a fan of not only science journalism, but maybe scientists. What if someone's like, okay, that's similar to a claim of racism, where you've interacted with a few women or a few minorities or a few of whatever, or of white people, and then you've had bad experiences, and so you generalize to all white people or to all males or what have you, rather than keeping the claims specific and not abstracting away. So how do you disembroil between critiquing science as a whole or scientists as a whole versus just the specific claims that you've investigated?
I think we're conflating two different things now. So the one is my trust issue, where I say I don't trust scientists because of what I've said. And the other is what's wrong with science overall. So I think when it comes to my trust issue, it's just a matter of, I want to see proof. So I'm not saying necessarily there is something wrong in these other disciplines. But I want to know reason why I should trust those people. So I think that the comparison is not quite adequate. It's actually, I'm exactly trying to not fall the Gell-Mann amnesia issue in saying, okay, but it's only a problem in this particular discipline, because I think it's a systemic problem. So I have no reason to assume that it doesn't also exist elsewhere. So when it comes to the issue with science overall, I'm more relying on data, which I talked about in a recent video. I've for a long time, I think this is also some connections that go back to Eric Weinstein, who I've known for a long time. So it's a really long story.
Sure.
In any case, so I've been very interested in the economic impact of technology, and there's a long background story about how progress seems to be slowing down, which is what Tyler Cowen, I think is his name. I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So,
The Economist.
Yeah. And other people have been working on for a long time. How do you actually quantify the impact of technology on our society? And at least my understanding of what they found is that progress has been slowing down. And there are a couple of different ways to look at it. So actually, Tyler himself seems to have recently said there seem to be some indications that the trend has been reversing, and then other people have disagreed with it. So this is its own research field.
I see.
And there have also I've been very interested in what's called scientometrics or bibliometric analysis of what can you squeeze out of the scientific literature. And I actually had a research project on this. So this is another long story that I don't want to get into. But so
you don't want to get into, or you want to?
no, I don't want to get into it because we'll still be talking at tomorrow morning.
Okay.
But so I know a little bit about bibliometric analysis, and I've worked on this myself. And there have been numerous papers saying that there are indications that scientific progress is actually slowing down. And you can always ask, like, exactly how did they measure scientific progress? And everyone does it in their own way. Like this is an entire art discipline, basically, where they make up new measures. And so the reason why I find it convincing is that it doesn't really matter exactly how they did it. They always found more or less the same thing, which is that scientific progress has been slowing down since the 1960s, 1970s, which is also consistent with this economic analysis. And then there is like the narrative side of this story, which is what John Horgan wrote about in his book, The End of Science, which is exactly what we started from, like this impression we're not really making progress on these big open questions, like they've been open for a long time and nothing seems to be happening. So John Horgan thinks that we've just reached the end of science, which is why his book is titled that way. And I think that that's a little bit too extreme, but I think his observation is basically correct. And he's actually written a new preface for the book at the 20-year anniversary, which was just a couple of years ago, in which he says, well, you know, I've investigated the points that I made in the book, and they basically turned out to be correct. You know, we haven't figured out what consciousness is. We still don't know what dark matter is. We still don't know what quantum gravity is. We're still talking vague words about what complexity is, and stuff like this. And I think it's basically correct. And so we cannot talk about the objections to this because they're always more or less the same. I find it a little bit tiring. You must get the same thing on social media, that they're always the same objections that come from people who have never heard of the topic before, and you just end up endlessly repeating the same things over and over again. So in this case, like, the typical objection is that as science gets more mature, it becomes more difficult to make progress, so progress slows down. And what you can hold against this, where on the other hand, the number of scientists is exponentially increasing, which already makes us a little bit suspect. And then the other issue is that different disciplines, if you look at something like medicine and physics, for example, like physics is much older than what people started. I mean, we can talk about exactly when did medicine actually start, but because there was a lot of hocus pocus in the early days. But serious medicine is much younger a discipline than physics, which is basically thousands of years old, especially astronomy. So what sense does it make that progress in all of these disciplines would slow down at the same time?
Right.
If it's just something to do with the nature of knowledge itself. It's not what it looks like. It looks like it's a systemic problem with the way that we organize research. And I understand that this is not a watertight argument, but I think it's quite plausible. And at the very least, you'd think it's something to take seriously, that we have to change something about the way that we organize science.
Okay, so then it's not an argument that the foundations haven't changed. It's more about questions have remained open and not answered in quite some time. And it's been that way for a variety of fields around the same time.
Yeah. So that's entirely right. So my biggest problem is not that these questions have remained open for such a long time, but that we're not getting anywhere. Like, so we're just doing the same thing over again, and it seems to be a systemic problem in all fields. So it just feels to me like something isn't quite right. Does it make sense?
Yeah, the only field I don't see this in, I don't see someone saying that there's a crisis in physics, crisis in ecology, meaning crisis. Everyone's in a crisis, except computer science.
Yeah, right.
And the foundations of computer science hasn't changed since the 40s, since even before physics. since Turing and Church. Now, there are unanswered questions about the limits of computability and complexity issues, but those are like machine code questions that are close to the base, but they don't question the base.
Yeah, so actually, I think one could make a fair point that pretty much all the progress that we see in science overall has actually been driven by maybe not exactly computer science, but computer science in the general sense, extended to technology, technological applications, data analysis, and so on and so forth. I mean, certainly, like in physics itself, if you, I remember when I was a student, if you had an integral that you could not solve, that was not in a table,
you just couldn't solve it.
That was the end of your research. You were like, okay, that's it. Can't solve this integral.
It's funny.
And this problem has just totally evaporated, right? You're like, okay, we can't solve this integral. We put it into computer, problem solved. And this is like such a trivial thing almost, how computing power has made such a big impact in physics. And it's certainly also in other disciplines. Like if you look at medicine, just data analysis, if you look at MRI, fMRI, all this stuff, it's you need to analyze this data. You need computers, right? So I think this is what it's driven by. But then you can also ask, well, what made this progress in computer science possible? And I would say, well, ultimately, it's all physics, right? You need to know, well, what are semiconductors? How do they work? What's the band gap? And all this kind of stuff. And, I know there are people who are arguing, like, this is not, like, historically, it's not how it happened. It was more an accidental thing. Some people were tinkering around with stuff here and there. It's not like they sat there and developed a theory for semiconductors and then they build it. This is not what happened. But I still think, like, if you look at it from a constructive point of view, in the sense of how does science build up, it goes back to our understanding of physics, of materials, of electricity, and so on. So this is where it comes from.
Yes.
And so, what we're doing right now is that we're trying to get out of the science that we have already discovered what we possibly can. So we're making computers smaller and smaller, and there's a lot left to do. Actually, John Horgan makes it very clear in his book that this is not what he's talking about. So there's a lot of stuff that you can build up on the science that we know already, for example, in computing, and there's also, robotics and so on, which kind of seems to be the next big thing that will come knocking at the door, seems to be robots.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of research left to do, but what he's concerned with, and what I'm also concerned with, are these big new discoveries about the world. And so, of course, I'm as a physicist, I'm very opinionated about these things, but I think that physics, and especially the foundations of physics, are a super important discipline, because it's where we get the deepest insights about nature. So if we don't make progress in the foundations of physics, then sooner or later, progress in all other disciplines is also going to run dry. And so I know this sounds a little bit bombastic, and there are a lot of people who would disagree with this. You probably know this entire argument about what do we actually mean by fundamental. Is biology any less fundamental than physics? I would say yes, but biologists might disagree. In any case, so I think that if we really want to make progress as a society as a whole, we need to make progress in the foundations of physics, in the sense of actually discovering some new phenomenon. Yeah, maybe understanding quantum mechanics. Maybe it's quantum gravity, though I personally think this is somewhat unlikely. But something really.
Yes. So you don't see your work on superdeterminism as just contributing to the useless papers that are produced?
No, of course not. And even if that was the case, I'd never admit it. No, but look, we already talked about this. Like I overthink everything. If I make a joke, I read like 3 books and I analyze joke structures, as you say, and I think about the subtext, and I try to find the most punchy phrase and which word comes in which order. How do I start? What's
oh, that's
stuff
interesting.
Like this.
Great,
right? And so this is also more or less how I've approached the question of what do I make my research on. This is why I wrote my first book. It was trying to figure out what should I spend my time on, because there's only so much time in my life. So what's the most promising thing to work on? And I've tried to take my own advice very seriously. Maybe not totally successful, but at least I've tried. And so I've tried to not work on the problems that I think are pseudo problems, but I've tried to focus on the problems that I said are real problems, where time is well spent. Now, the issue is that I couldn't get funding to work on those. And this is why I'm now in the position that I am, where I'm funding my own research by making videos on YouTube. And I rely a lot on people supporting me, like people on Patreon, people who join my channel, who I'm super, super grateful for, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. And so the reason I ended up working on the superdeterminism stuff is that I arrived at the conclusion like that the best way to make progress is to figure out what happens in a measurement in quantum mechanics, and why this particular problem, because we know it's something that is in the measurable range. Like it's literally a measurement process. Like it happens in the laboratory all the time, and it quite plausibly has a relevance for practical applications, exactly because it's in a parameter range that is easily experimentally accessible, that we actually already access with devices that we build.
Do you have any new ideas about quantum gravity?
About quantum gravity? No, because I've been focusing on this measurement issue. So I've eventually, well, kind of, yes, but so I know this now sounds very confusing. So I've for some while suspected that maybe the two problems are actually related. Partly because, as you know, Penrose has this idea that actually the collapse of the wave function is somehow caused by gravity. And I'm not super happy with this particular model of how it works. And so I've tried to find a different way to combine these ideas. And I've actually, like in the past month, I've actually made some progress, which I think is pretty exciting.
Great.
I don't know how much you want to hear about it, because it'll get a little bit...
Yeah, I would love to hear about it, especially if you're in collaboration with Tim Palmer, or if it's different than his.
No, he doesn't like it. So I don't know what. So we talk about it, and he gives me good feedback, but I think he doesn't really like the idea.
Okay.
So it goes back to a paper which I wrote like 10 years ago or something, which is kind of vaguely called a possibility to solve the problem with quantizing gravity or something. And what I was trying to point out in this paper is that just on purely logical reasons, there is a possibility to solve the problems with quantizing gravity that no one has previously talked about, which is that all these problems which we have, if we perturbatively quantize gravity, and then, the theory produces all these infinities, it's not renormalizable, and all these problems, then we need string theory or loop quantum gravity. They appear at really high energies, which we haven't tested.
Yes.
And so in particularly, we don't know that quantum physics itself actually works the same in this energy range as it does at low energies. So I said, what we can do is that if we go to these high energies where perturbatively quantized gravity becomes problematic, we just say quantum effects go all away. So we go back to classical physics. And so you see then these two problems suddenly become the same problem. That's the reason we can't quantize gravity, is that we don't understand where quantum effects go in a measurement.
Yes.
And once you make this connection, you have a method of quantifying where the deviations from quantum mechanics should occur, because now you can estimate that it should come with the size of the quantum gravitational effects, which don't happen, if that makes sense. So you say it has to happen in this range for those quantum problematic quantum gravitational contributions to go away. And so even if you don't exactly know how it works, like what's the exact mechanism that makes it go away, it gives you a way to estimate the range in which it should happen. And I've done this. Another depressing part of the story is that I couldn't think of any experiment that would actually access this range. So, which is unfortunate.
Right. So you're part of the problem.
Well, you see, what I could do now is I could come up with a reason for why this is accessible with the next experiment that I'm going to build somewhere. And that's exactly what I don't want to do. And so now I have this problem. Okay, so I finally have found a way to do it. I found a way to make this estimate. But it's not particularly interesting because you can't test it. So now what do? So I've decided for myself, I'm going to write it up anyway. And put it out there because maybe someone else can think of a way to test it. But yes, so that's the current status.
So I'm confused about the proposal. So you're saying that at high energies, quantum effects may diminish because we have some problems with quantum gravity only at high energies. Like there's low energy combinations of GR with QFT. Okay. And then you're making a connection between that and the measurement problem. But the measurement problem occurs at low energies as well, no?
Yes, that's exactly the right question to ask, because when I was talking about high energy, that was a very vague way to explain the idea. So the question is exactly what is the quantity that you need to compute?
I see.
And energy, so first of all, normally if they talk about the high energy expansion, it's not actually energy, but it's something like momentum transfer. So it has the scale of an energy. But first of all, you want to use something that's actually Lorentz invariant. So energy is already bad. And so then you can think about, should we use mass? But mass doesn't really make sense either. And so I've eventually come up with a way to do it in the path integral, because that fits very well together with a paper that I wrote several years ago. And you can then estimate the contribution from this quantum mechanical term in the path integral, which we know how it looks like. So this is, again, this is the nice thing about it. We know how this contribution looks like to the normal, term without the quantum gravitational contribution. You can ask, well, when does this crossover happen? Like when does this term have approximately the same size as this other term? And so it's more complicated than energy. It's something like a space-time integral over the stress energy momentum tensor coupled to the metric, if that makes sense. Sure. Something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the profusion of papers produced, which was covered by The Economist. They have an article explaining this issue simply and concisely called "Scientific Publishers Are Producing More Papers Than Ever." They confirm what you've been saying, at least from a financial incentive standpoint. They're saying that the reasons are based on business models or subscription fees. However, they brought up special issues as another reason, and I haven't heard you mention that before.
Well, yeah, I mean, the special issue is also something that I've talked about. So basically, the issue is that publishers make money by selling stuff. They sell subscriptions to journals or books or special issues. But they don't want to spend the money to produce the content. And so they've caught into life these special issues where they recruit what's called a guest editor. And the guest editor invites people to write contributions to the special issue on some topic. And then they publish this special issue and they basically sell it to libraries. And I think so first of all, I don't want to diss all special issues. It started from a good idea, I think, to give some space for rapidly emerging fields where you don't have a lot of people who know each other. So you want to collect all these people in one issue. So a new field has something to start from. It's the same idea as with the rapid response workshops that they do in some places, if you ever heard of this. There's a new issue that is emerging in the scientific community. You want to give people some networking opportunities. They need to get to know each other. They need to develop their new language. And so the special issues came out of the same idea. But then what's happened is that some certain publishers have abused this to cheaply produce content, and they make money by selling it. And this has certainly contributed to the number of publications rising. I haven't read the article in The Economist, but I think that's correct. I'm not actually sure that this is like the biggest issue. So this has been going on for at least, I don't know, since before COVID. This time I'll get it right. And so what I've seen in the past 3 years or something is that everyone knows, like, this is basically, it's not really sound stuff to do, and more people just don't want to have anything to do with it. So I would expect that this is actually already declining at this point.
So my ending question is a meta question. Given that you're much more skilled at this than myself, what should we title this video?
Oh dear. Sabine Ausenfelder talks a lot of bullshit. I'm pretty sure this
Sabina's
yeah,
drivel.
but though I have to warn you, what's going to happen? You're getting flagged by YouTube for mild profanity in the title.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess pick the most interesting one. I'm not sure if it's good to have my name in the title, if that is more attractive or more repulsive. But I guess there's no way around it, right? I mean, otherwise, how are people supposed to know what's in the video?
So, okay, one that occurs to me is the stagnation in physics. Rather than the crisis in physics, now, if I wanted to be more galvanic, I could put the crisis in science. But what would you say? I may just take what you're going to say here and put it on, and people will see.
Oh dear, you're putting me on the spot. Yeah, well, the issue, the potential issue with this title is that it must have appeared like 24 times already. This idea with the crisis in science, a crisis in physics. Maybe use something like, related, but not exactly the same in terms of words, like maybe what's going wrong in physics, or maybe I have already used this as a title. So you better check this.
Yeah, I don't want to compete with the great Sabina.
Yeah, well, you get the idea. Just don't use exactly the same words that other people have already used, because people might think, well, it's just the same stuff all over again.
Why string theory is correct.
Yeah, but then people will feel misled, right?
No,
because
of course.
What we talked about.
Of course.
Okay, it was a joke. Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's my okay, first, by the way, that's a joke. And then secondly, that's my definition of clickbait, is when it, not just something that is piquant, but that it doesn't deliver.
Yeah, right. Exactly, right. Honestly, I think when people say that my videos are clickbait, what they're referring to are the stupid photos of me with the facial expression on the thumbnail, for which I have a very simple explanation, is that I don't know what else to put on the thumbnail. If you must know this problem. Like, you talk about super abstract stuff. What the hell do you put on the thumbnail other than yourself?
Yes,
and this is why I have like a whole collection of 100 photos of me making silly faces, just so there's something to put there.
So the way that it works, just if you want some behind the scenes for our channel, the way that it works is that the full podcasts that are 1 hour to 3 hours long, the full ones, they have my minute attention on the title and the thumbnail titles. There's two different types of titles for people who are unfamiliar. There's the YouTube title, and then there's what we call the thumb text. So we play around with different combinations and we test some, but it does have my personal touch. But then we also take out clips from those because not everyone has the stamina or want to watch a 5-hour podcast. So we take out 10 to 15 minute clips. And that's a marketer. I have a marketing guy, a fantastic marketing guy who's in charge of daily clips. And he does that. And I tell him, just don't, as long as it's not, it doesn't say Penrose reveals his theory, like the word reveal, it would get more clicks. We've tested that, but we've said, okay, no, that's too much. The hidden nature of quantum mechanics, hidden is another one that we removed, even though hidden actually works. Like we just tested a title called The Hidden Potential of the Brain, and it works better than the potential of the brain. But I and even the marketer himself didn't like that. And so we just went back to the potential of the brain.
Oh, that's very
But anyhow, he's in charge of the daily clip titles and thumb text, whereas the full podcast get much more of this. The fact that I'm even asking you, getting your actual opinion, it has my fingers in it.
Yeah, so you must also have tried this. Like there are a variety of AI plugs that you can use to generate titles, and they're so hilariously bad. Like it's hidden is one of those words, and reveals, and blasting the myth of the something or other with lots of capitals.
You don't want to miss it.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
And it's cringy to me. Maybe they would work.
Yeah, I can't even get myself, so this is something I've discussed with my agency, there are a lot of people who put capital words in the title. And I've tried this a few times, but every time I look at it, I'm like, I just can't do it. And I remove it again. Yeah, okay, so we still don't know what you're going to call the video. No,
I may say what's wrong with physics or something like that. I think that what you said is correct, and I'm going to blame you. So if I get criticized for being clickbait, I'm going to respond to each comment.
You can blame me. Yes.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that the word clickbait, it's so overused at this point. It's pretty much meaningless. So I remember a time when clickbait was a title that you had to click on it to find out what it even was about. Right. So it's like stereotypically this thing, she woke up for her wedding day. You won't believe what happened next. So this is this stereotypical clickbait type. Or
this grandmother in Utah found that toothpaste does ...
Exactly that sort of thing. And so now we have some sort of clickbaitish title that people don't even recognize as clickbait. So for example, there was a video which kind of titled "The Man Who Killed the Most People in History." And maybe whose video this was. But you have to click on the stupid video to figure out that it was about the guy who put lead in gasoline or something.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, and I would call this is stereotypical clickbait because you have to click on it to know what it even is about. But I think people don't register this stuff as clickbait, which I find kind of interesting. So it's just an observation that I think that...
I wouldn't call that clickbait. The reason why is, to me, the content has to have a mismatch between itself and then the title. So in that case, it sounded like the person delivered. They must have some reason for suggesting that person killed the most people. I thought it was going to be Stalin or Hitler or someone who dropped the bombs.
No. I didn't really look into it. It's quite. I guess it's probably correct.
Sure.
So you see,
I understand.
I wouldn't use the word clickbait in that sense because the examples that we just mentioned, like the stereotypical clickbait, we really love this 5 everyday hacks or whatever. They actually do deliver the stuff. You just you have to click on it to figure out that it's some super dumb stuff.
Yes.
So whatever. Okay.
All right. Sounds like a great place to stop.
Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, lovely to talk to you, and it was great meeting you in person.
Oh yeah. We should do it again at some point.
Don't go anywhere just yet. Now I have a recap of today's episode brought to you by The Economist. Just as The Economist brings clarity to complex concepts, we're doing the same with our new AI-powered episode recap. Here's a concise summary of the key insights from today's podcast.
Welcome to our deep dive into this fascinating conversation. It's between Kurt Jomagul, host of Theories of Everything, and physicist Sabine Hossenfelder.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard people talking about a stagnation in physics these days, and that's what they tackled head on.
Right.
We've got their conversation as our source material here. And it's really packed with insights about
that was a great conflict round.
Their physics stands today and what the future may hold.
What I think is so interesting is Kurt, he really dives deep into the mathematical side of things. He actually kind of pushes back on some of Sabine's points while agreeing with others.
Yeah.
So it's this really cool dynamic.
Yeah, they start right off the bat tackling, is physics in a state of crisis or is it stagnation?
Right.
And Sabine, as you probably know, prefers the term stagnating.
Stagnation, right. And she uses this cool analogy of physicists running on a treadmill.
Yeah.
Lots of effort, lots of papers, lots of, conferences and things, but no real movement forward. And she's talking specifically about the foundations of physics.
Okay.
Those big questions that we've been puzzled by for decades now. Dark matter, quantum gravity, the interpretation of quantum mechanics.
So she's saying it's not that physicists aren't working hard. It's that the current approaches or methods just aren't yielding those breakthroughs.
Yeah, I think that's really the core of her argument, is that despite decades of research, we haven't had any significant shift in our understanding in these fundamental mysteries.
But Kurt, who's no stranger to complex theories himself, offers a slightly different perspective.
He does. He's very much interested in the mathematical intricacies of some areas of physics that Sabine considers less fruitful. Things like soft theorems or asymptotic symmetries or gauge gravity dualities.
Yeah.
And he acknowledges that those haven't led to new fundamental physics yet, but he sees this mathematical elegance as potentially a sign of something deeper.
So they're both wrestling with this question of progress, but they're coming at it from slightly different angles.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and this leads to this really interesting discussion about, what even constitutes a real problem in physics. And Sabine argues that some problems might actually be pseudo-problems.
Right.
Meaning nature might just be that way.
Right.
Even if it doesn't fit our current theoretical frameworks.
Yeah.
So could you give an example of that?
Sure. So she points to the strong CP problem.
Okay.
Where there's this certain kind of symmetry violation that should exist theoretically, but it doesn't seem to show up in our observations of the universe.
Okay.
And she says, maybe this isn't really a problem to be solved. Maybe this is just a feature of the universe.
She's challenging this idea that we need to always strive for these really neat, elegant explanations.
I think that's right. Yeah. She pushes back against this notion of naturalness, which has been a guiding principle in theoretical physics for a long time. But, as she points out, naturalness has led to a lot of incorrect predictions.
Yeah.
Things like the expectation of supersymmetry at the Large Hadron Collider, which hasn't panned out.
Right. So it's almost like she's saying our sense of aesthetics or our desire for things to be a certain way might be clouding our judgment.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
When it comes to understanding the universe.
Yeah. She argues that, sometimes what seems unnatural to us might just be the way that nature operates.
Yeah.
And this ties into her broader critique about the way that research is conducted today.
Oh, right. The systemic problems within academia. Let's unpack that a bit.
One of her main concerns is this over-reliance on short-term grants, which forces researchers into this kind of publish or perish mentality where they're constantly, chasing funding, churning out papers instead of, pursuing these long-term risky projects that might lead to really groundbreaking discoveries.
So it's almost like the system itself discourages boldness.
Yeah, that's what she's arguing. And it creates these sort of self-reinforcing bubbles where researchers get stuck in specific subfields because that's where the funding is. That's what's expected for career advancement.
Right. So what's the alternative? Does she offer any solutions?
She brings up this idea of a scientific underground,
Okay.
Which is this community of researchers that are operating outside of traditional academia and are free to pursue their passions without the constraints of, grant deadlines and institutional pressures.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. It's almost like this band of rebels pushing the boundaries.
She definitely sees it as a potential source of fresh ideas and new innovative approaches.
Yeah.
But she also acknowledges that these independent researchers face many challenges, particularly the lack of access to resources and community support.
Right.
She shares a story about a researcher who couldn't even post their PhD thesis on ArXiv.
Oh, wow.
Which is usually, a pretty standard practice.
Yeah.
And that really highlights the barriers that they face.
Absolutely. And this leads into another really key point in their conversation, which is this issue of public trust in science.
Yeah.
And Sabine argues that, these systemic problems within academia,
right,
this sense that things are kind of stuck, actually contributes to the growing distrust in scientific expertise.
I think that's a really fascinating connection.
Yeah. And so she's saying by acknowledging these problems, being upfront about them,
right,
the scientific community can start to rebuild that trust.
That's exactly what she's arguing, this idea that transparency and a willingness to acknowledge limitations are crucial for regaining that public confidence.
It's not about pretending everything's perfect.
Right.
But it's about showing that the process is robust enough to handle criticism and self-correction.
And this is where they bring in a broader perspective, and they start talking about whether this slowdown in progress is actually happening across multiple fields, not just physics. So they discuss insights from economics, and this field of scientometrics, which studies the patterns of scientific publishing and discovery.
Okay.
They even reference work by Tyler Cowen and John Horgan, who have argued that we are seeing a general slowdown in scientific progress across the board.
So it's not just physicists who are feeling this.
It seems not to be.
This stagnation.
And what's really interesting is they push back against this common counterargument that progress naturally slows down as fields mature.
Right.
They point out that we're seeing this slowdown across disciplines of varying ages.
Okay.
And, we can't ignore the fact that the number of scientists worldwide has been increasing exponentially.
Right.
So if it were simply a matter of scientific maturity, wouldn't we expect to see at least some fields still making rapid progress?
Right. So it's not just that we plucked all the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, and they seem to point towards the structure of scientific institutions themselves as a potential factor.
Right. And this brings us back to these issues that we talked about.
It's exactly.
The publish or perish, the short-term grants.
The over-specialization.
Yeah. And so it's like we've inadvertently built a system that discourages,
not stifles,
the very creativity that drives scientific progress.
Exactly. And that's why, both Kurt and Sabine see this conversation as so crucial. They believe that acknowledging these systemic challenges is the first step towards finding solutions.
Right.
It's about recognizing that the way we organize and fund scientific research has a profound impact on the types of questions we ask.
Right.
And the types of discoveries we make.
It makes you wonder, do we need a fundamental rethink of how we approach science?
Yeah.
A shift away from this hyper-competitive, short-term focus towards a more, collaborative, long-term vision.
It's a challenging prospect, but it's one that I think they both believe is worth taking on.
Absolutely.
They express hope that by bringing these issues to light, they can spark new conversations and inspire the next generation of scientists to think differently about how we pursue knowledge and understanding.
So it's not about giving up on science. It's about being, realistic.
It's about recognizing the limitations.
Recognizing the limitations and being willing to imagine these new possibilities.
Exactly. It's about embracing that spirit of inquiry and exploration that lies at the heart of science. This drive to ask big questions, to challenge assumptions, and to really push the boundaries of what we know.
And, maybe as Sabine suggests, part of the solution lies in fostering a community.
Absolutely.
One that values a wider range of perspectives, both within traditional institutions and,
and that scientific underground.
Then that scientific underground.
It's a really inspiring vision.
It is.
It's a future where scientific progress is driven not by, competition and individual ambition.
Right.
But by collaboration, curiosity, and the shared commitment to unraveling the mysteries of the universe. Right. They talked about this publish or perish culture and how it can sometimes prioritize quantity over quality.
It's a real dilemma.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we want researchers to share their findings widely.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we don't want to incentivize rushed or superficial work.
Yeah, it's this tough balance.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And they both highlight the rise of special issues in journals as a particularly concerning trend.
Yeah.
And while these special issues can sometimes serve a legitimate purpose,
like showcasing a rapidly developing field, they've also been used by some publishers to just churn out content quickly and boost profits.
So there's a potential conflict of interest there.
That's a concern, yeah.
If publishers are prioritizing profit over scientific rigor, that could have a detrimental effect.
That's their concern.
On the quality of research.
And they both see this as part of this larger systemic problem within academia.
Right.
This pressure to publish as much as possible.
Yeah.
Often at the expense of deep, thoughtful inquiry.
And it's not just about the quality of research.
Right.
It also ties back into public trust.
Exactly.
If people feel that the research is being driven by financial motives rather than genuine pursuit of knowledge, it can erode their confidence.
Exactly. That's why Sabine emphasizes transparency and accountability within the scientific community.
Okay.
She believes that acknowledging these systemic issues is crucial for rebuilding public trust and demonstrating that the scientific process, despite its flaws, is still the best way to understand the world.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that science is a human endeavor with all the complexities and imperfections that come with that.
Absolutely. And having those honest conversations about the challenges and limitations, both within the scientific community and with the public.
Speaking of challenges, let's go back to this idea of a scientific underground.
Yeah.
It's a compelling vision. These researchers operating outside of traditional institutions.
Right.
Free from the pressures of academia.
Right.
But as you pointed out, there are these hurdles.
There are significant hurdles
to overcome.
Independent researchers often lack access to resources, funding, even just a supportive community.
It seems like a catch-22.
It
is. You
is.
need resources and support to conduct research.
Right.
But you need to have already done research to get those resources and support.
Exactly. And this is where they see the need for a fundamental shift. In how we think about and support science. They believe we need pathways for people to engage in scientific exploration, regardless of their institutional affiliations.
So it's about fostering a vibrant scientific ecosystem.
Precisely.
One that values a wider range of perspectives and approaches.
And that leads us to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into the broader implications of this slowdown. And explore what the future might hold for scientific discovery and innovation.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this really insightful conversation with Kurt Jemungel and Sabine Hossenfelder. We've covered a lot of ground, from superdeterminism to the challenges in scientific publishing today. But I think now let's tackle this big question of the potential slowdown in scientific progress.
It's a big one, and it's something that they explored in depth. Drawing on insights from economics, history, the study of scientific publications themselves. And they paint this picture that's really thought-provoking, but also a bit unsettling.
It is unsettling because we tend to think of science as this ever-advancing force constantly pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Right.
What if we've hit a plateau? What if the pace of groundbreaking discoveries is actually slowing down?
It's a question that has been rued by others, Tyler Powen, John Horgan, who we mentioned earlier. And what I find interesting is Kurt and Sabine don't dismiss this idea. They engage with it thoughtfully. They bring in data that suggests a potential decline in, groundbreaking discoveries since the mid-20th century.
That's pretty wild. And they also challenge that easy explanation, right? This idea that progress naturally slows down as fields mature.
Exactly. They point out that this slowdown seems to be happening across disciplines regardless of their age. And we can't ignore the fact that the number of scientists worldwide has been growing exponentially. So if it were simply a matter of, scientific maturity, wouldn't we expect at least some fields to still be making rapid progress?
It seems like there's something else going on. And they point towards the structure of scientific institutions themselves as a potential factor.
Yeah. They bring us back to the issues that we talked about earlier. The publish or perish pressure, the short-term grant cycles, the over-specialization within fields. It's as if we've created a system that rewards incremental advancements over bold, risky leaps into the unknown.
Right. It's almost like we've accidentally built a system that stifles creativity.
Yeah.
Which is supposed to be, the engine of science.
That's exactly right. And that's precisely why both Kurt and Sabine see this conversation as so crucial. They believe that acknowledging these systemic challenges is the first step towards finding solutions. It's about recognizing that the way we organize and fund scientific research has a profound impact on the kinds of questions we ask and the types of discoveries that we make.
It makes you wonder, do we need a fundamental rethink? Like, how do we approach science? A shift away from this hyper-competitive short-term focus and toward a more collaborative long-term vision.
It's a tough challenge for sure, but it's one that Kurt and Sabine believe is worth taking on.
Yeah.
They express hope that by, bringing these issues to light, they can spark new conversations and inspire the next generation of scientists to think differently about how we pursue knowledge and how we pursue understanding.
So it's not about giving up on science or being disillusioned?
No, it's about being realistic.
It's about recognizing the limitations of our current systems and being willing to imagine new possibilities.
It's about embracing that spirit of inquiry and exploration that lies at the heart of science. The drive to ask these big questions, to challenge assumptions, and to push the boundaries of what we know and what we understand. Absolutely. Yeah. One that values a wider range of perspectives and approaches, both within traditional institutions and within that scientific underground that we talked about earlier.
It's a really inspiring vision. A future where scientific progress is driven not by competition and individual ambition, but by collaboration, curiosity, and a shared commitment to unraveling the mysteries of the universe.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on, I think. We've covered so much in this deep dive, questions about stagnation, this mind-bending world of superdeterminism, the challenges facing scientific publishing, and ultimately the very nature of scientific progress itself.
And that's what's so great about this conversation between Kurt and Sabine. It's really sparked so many new ideas and new lines of inquiry.
We've only just scratched the surface here, though.
Yeah.
We've offered a glimpse into this really fascinating conversation that is full of insights and provocations. Now it's your turn to ponder these ideas, to explore these questions further, and maybe even challenge some of your own assumptions about the world and how we understand it.
Yeah, keep that scientific spirit alive. Keep asking those big questions. Stay curious and never stop exploring.
Worth taking on.
Yeah.
They express hope that by, bringing these issues to light, they can spark new conversations and inspire the next generation of scientists to think differently about how we pursue knowledge and how we pursue understanding.
So it's not about giving up on science or being disillusioned?
No, it's about being realistic.
It's about recognizing the limitations of our current systems and being willing to imagine new possibilities.
It's about embracing that spirit of inquiry and exploration that lies at the heart of science. The drive to ask these big questions, to challenge assumptions, and to push the boundaries of what we know and what we understand. Absolutely. Yeah. One that values a wider range of perspectives and approaches, both within traditional institutions and within that scientific underground that we talked about earlier.
It's a really inspiring vision. A future where scientific progress is driven not by competition and individual ambition, but by collaboration, curiosity, and a shared commitment to unraveling the mysteries of the universe.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on, I think. We've covered so much in this deep dive, questions about stagnation, this mind-bending world of superdeterminism, the challenges facing scientific publishing, and ultimately the very nature of scientific progress itself.
And that's what's so great about this conversation between Kurt and Sabine. It's really sparked so many new ideas and new lines of inquiry.
We've only just scratched the surface here, though.
Yeah.
We've offered a glimpse into this really fascinating conversation that is full of insights and provocations. Now it's your turn to ponder these ideas, to explore these questions further, and maybe even challenge some of your own assumptions about the world and how we understand it.
Yeah, keep that scientific spirit alive. Keep asking those big questions. Stay curious and never stop exploring.
New update. Started a Substack. Writings on there are currently about language and ill-defined concepts, as well as some other mathematical details. Much more being written there. This is content that isn't anywhere else. It's not on Theories of Everything. It's not on Patreon. Also, full transcripts will be placed there at some point in the future. Several people ask me, hey Kurt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, philosophy, and consciousness. What are your thoughts? While I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. Also, thank you to our partner, The Economist. Firstly, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed or clicked that like button, now is the time to do so. Why? Because each subscribe Each like helps YouTube push this content to more people like yourself. Plus, it helps out Kurt directly, aka me. I also found out last year that external links count plenty toward the algorithm, which means that whenever you share on Twitter, say on Facebook or even on Reddit, etc., it shows YouTube, hey, people are talking about this content outside of YouTube, which in turn greatly aids the distribution on YouTube. Thirdly, there's a remarkably active Discord and subreddit for Theories of Everything, where people explicate TOEs, they disagree respectfully about theories, and build as a community our own TOE. Links to both are in the description. Fourthly, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all of the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gained from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comments that, hey, TOE listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whichever podcast catcher you use. And finally, if you'd like to support more conversations like this, more content like this, then do consider visiting patreon.com/KurtJMungle and donating with whatever you like. There's also PayPal, there's also crypto, there's also just joining on YouTube. Again, keep in mind, it's support from the sponsors and you that allow me to work on TOE full time. You also get early access to ad-free episodes, whether it's audio or video. It's audio in the case of Patreon, video in the case of YouTube. For instance, this episode that you're listening to right now was released a few days earlier. Every dollar helps far more than you think. Either way, your viewership is generosity enough. Thank you so much.